Well, it's an honor now and a delight to welcome His Excellency Shaikh Mohammed bin Khalifa bin Ahmed Al Khalifa, the Minister of Oil, to Bahrain. A graduate to no less than 4 degrees from King Fahd University, Cambridge University, Imperial College, and DePaul University in the US, His Excellency, prior to his appointment as Minister of Oil in 2016, worked at the Ministry of Finance, during which he oversaw the privatization of key projects. He is also chairman of the National Oil and Gas Authority, the Oil and Gas Holding Company, BAPCO, and Tatweer, and is a board member of the Central Bank of Bahrain. So please join me in inviting him to deliver the inaugural address. Please, thank you. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a true honor for me to be here with you in the presence of some of the regional industry titans, people who I've had the honor of serving in many boards, and I can tell you I have learned a lot from. So truly an honor for me for the first time to be with you here in GPCA. A very interesting chart, just to see what has been happening to petrochemicals industry and plastics. In particular, you can see GDP growth and how metals like aluminum and steel have trended exactly as GDP growth has grown over the years. But if you look at plastics, it was on a different level altogether. It experienced tremendous growth, which probably is due to a lot of the innovation with material science and plastics coming into everyday life. You can see more of the consumer products, cars, etc., using plastics, which tells you that innovation is really critical for that trend to continue. It is also linked to economic growth, as consumption in many countries has increased multiple times. Is that phenomenon going to continue? That truly is the challenge that we have listened to our previous speaker, His Excellency, the Chairman of GPCA, that the industry is going to face. There are headwinds that everybody sees, and global economic growth is certainly one of them. There is consensus that we are witnessing a slowdown in demand growth. For many reasons, trade wars, the currency challenge, the strong US dollar is never a good thing for this industry, and the commoditization of a lot of the products that we have been producing here in the region, and of course the drive to go into specialty chemicals is certainly in the discussions in this forum, I am sure. Well, GCC is now truly an important partner to the rest of the world in petrochemicals and plastics in particular. The advantage of feedstock has brought us into the map. Will that continue? So far, I think the challenges are clear. We are looking at going towards liquid cracking versus the traditional ethane cracking. Geographically, we are not advantaged. We do not have large markets and hence have the disadvantage of exporting. If we look at what Southeast Asia has been doing, their focus is primarily on liquid cracking, and the feedstock advantage has played the role for the GCC to arrive to where it is in the global position in petrochemicals. So for the future, as the scarcity of the gas feedstock becomes apparent, we're all talking about refinery integration, and mixed feed cracking is the new norm. Does that integration give you enough economic advantage? It is a debate, but certainly not comparable to the very large advantage that cheap ethane would give you. Integration does help. It does save costs. It does help with waste streams from the refinery and the petrochemical plants going back and forth. So maybe not exactly the same value that a low-cost ethane feedstock would deliver. But nevertheless, it does provide a lot of advantages. So, for example, what we're doing in Bahrain now, we have started the construction of the largest refinery expansion, and we focused on a residual upgrade hydrocracker, which is a huge consumer of hydrogen. When integrated with an aromatics plant, for example, that integration becomes very apparent. The aromatic plant, as you know, produces a lot of quote-unquote waste hydrogen, which has the best home for it in a residual hydrocracker. What that hydrocracker would do is pass the molecules of hydrogen into fuel oil and convert that to diesel. And as you know, with the IMO rulings, the International Maritime Organization, banning high sulfur fuel oil by 2020, the margins between fuel oil and gas oil, which is diesel, is going to increase even more. It might reach more than $30 a barrel. And hence the value of that integration can be met, but it is not always there and maybe not as valuable as the cheap feedstock of the past. So how competitive is refinery integration for ethylene production versus cheap feedstock? Well, as you can see, not as competitive, and hence the challenge of that story. Can you make up for cheap ethane with a mixed cracker if you integrate with the refinery? Certainly value to be made, but not quite as much as what cheap feedstock would do. So the norm in the past was location. Either you are located near a cheap feedstock or you're located near a very large market. And if you have both, then you're extremely lucky. And I think the true revolution has been what's happening in North America with shale. And as you know, shale has a lot of light end components, which is exactly what petrochemicals need. So competitiveness drivers of the past, I think we did have and enjoyed cheap energy costs, which did not allow us to focus on cost optimization. And if you look at other regions like the European Union, where they had to innovate and continuously develop themselves to meet the needs of the market and the increasing costs of energy, it got them to do a lot of thinking, a lot of collaboration, exactly what the chairman was mentioning. And this is what the region is now facing. This is exactly what we need to look at. I think it is very prudent to look at the examples of what the petrochemical industry has done in Europe, what it has done in North America. These are more mature markets that have faced the exact same challenges that the region is now facing. So very important to look at that model, look at the solutions they put forward, and really follow the successful ones and avoid the mistakes they have made. One of the things that we have done successfully at the GCC was the electricity grid. That has been a really valuable asset for the GCC. We have been talking about a gas grid, which is still a very good idea to have. But what Europe has done, and North America, has gone beyond that, and they've got networks for chemical streams, whether it's feedstock or products. So an ethylene grid would probably be a very good thing to think about. And this is probably a challenge for GPCA to look at. If a study that has merit can be delivered to the GCC Secretariat, it could certainly be addressed at the relevant ministerial level at some point. But this is the kind of integration that I'm sure we're all talking about. At the upstream level, when you have extra production of lighter ends that you have no room for, if a network like this exists, it is very easy to pass it across the board. And I will tell you about some of the opportunities Bahrain might be facing in terms of having light end feedstock opportunities, but really without having the relevant asset base to convert it into usable products. So a very important topic to handle, a lot to learn from, especially what's happening in the European Union, and I would leave that with GPCA to take on with the members and see if there is truly merit in that for the future. What they've also done is that they've moved from looking at their own individual asset base to more of a cluster optimization approach, where they group together and look at things like supply chain optimization, energy efficiencies, etc., in a cluster format. Very good examples to follow. This has been done before. They have made mistakes and have learned from them. It is worthwhile to really study in detail what worked for them and what could truly work for this region as you face the headwinds that you see coming towards us in the very near future. Industry 4.0, very much a marketing jargon now. I think it's important. We need to understand it. I don't think we should believe technology companies that want to sell products, but really focus on the experts we have within. A wise man once told me, who's now a retired Sabiq executive, that steel industry is very easy to operate, but a very difficult market. The chemicals industry is a more challenging operating environment, but a very easy market to sell to. Well, with the headwinds, that market might not be as easy as it was, and hence the operation has to become as easy as what the metal industry has been facing. And Industry 4.0 could bring technology to help us, but it should be led by your internal engineers, because it is as good as your systems have been designed to achieve. It's basically probes that monitor your plants 24/7 and tell you whenever there is a problem, give you the opportunity to do preventative maintenance, give you more availability, less maintenance cost. And I think ultimately you should keep an eye on these KPIs before we get dragged by the Industry 4.0, the Internet of Things. We've seen technology being marketed to us too quickly without giving us a lot of value. Operational excellence, I'm sure you are more experts about this than I am, but truly critical for boards and executive management to focus on a handful, maybe a maximum of 2 handsful of KPIs. And that's the language that boards have to start learning. Watch those KPIs, look at your peers, and that's the true discussion that boards and executives should be having. Without going through the mundane challenges of everyday operations, this would keep people on the right track. Look at your energy efficiencies, look at your costs, look at your margins, etc., and that ultimately would give you your operational excellence in full cooperation between boards and management. The internal culture, I think it's sometimes dangerous to accept that if you've reached the peak, you can sustain it. I think we have exemplary companies in the region, fantastic track record with amazing leadership. But is that leadership being passed down to future generations? It is always a challenge. We always have cultural shifts as time progresses. So never keep your eye away from developing the younger generation. Make sure they are as disciplined as the previous generation was. Safety, security, discipline, very important in a volatile environment where accidents could happen. And sometimes if the operation has been doing very well for years, people get complacent, and as the industry has taught us, that's when an incident is waiting to happen. But very important to make sure that performance culture, safety culture is a continuous struggle and strive for every organization. Never feel complacent. I'd like to talk about another challenge that the industry is facing, and it's the environmental challenge. Plastics have a negative rapport, you can see, especially with what it's doing to marine life. There is a bit of an exaggeration, but that could potentially put or dampen demand growth. The industry has to do a lot to make it more of a circular economy. What do you do with consumed plastics? I think recycling, people have found, is not the best of approaches. Most of what is being recycled gets landfilled anyway. People have been looking at chemical recycling versus mechanical recycling. But what a lot of European countries, I think, found is that incineration is probably the best form of recycling plastics. And the more plastics you have, the more calorific value you have. So household waste does not burn well, does not give you energy. You need to have plastics in it. And what they've done is they have very advanced flue gas treatment, so they have zero emissions. What we need to do in the region to promote the environmental, to avoid the negative environmental impact of plastics, which is not the industry's direct problem, it's how the consumers deal with it once they throw it in the oceans, in the streets, etc. If there was value to collect it, use it in conversion of waste to energy, that would probably be a better way of recycling plastics. I think the industry should try and promote that to avoid some of the potential negative rhetoric coming into the future. And I can see it growing. I can see a lot of the news pieces coming out. There was this news of a whale that was found beached with tons of plastics in its gut. That certainly is going to have a negative impact on the industry, and we should certainly look at ways to avoid that. Now, before I end, I'd like to talk to you about what we have been doing in Bahrain. We have announced a tight oil discovery, and that's the trend. I think the world has not had giant discoveries in conventional oil and gas fields. So the US has been in the forefront of this, and I don't know if you know, but shale oil, tight oil, whatever you want to call it, is primarily what's called volatile oil. It has to be in the light oil window, which means it has to have a significant gas component. If it is heavier oil, it will not flow, and hence shale is very much a light oil phenomenon. That's good for the industry because it means it is associated with a lot of light ends, as the US has discovered. In Bahrain, we are part of geologically what's called the Ghawar uplift. It is part of the giant Ghawar field of Saudi Arabia. It covers a region in Saudi Arabia called the Jafurah Basin, which maybe Amin and Nasser can talk about later. In Bahrain, we call it the Khalij al-Bahrain Basin. It is in the right spot, as you want it to be. It's between the 9 and the 11,000 feet, which you need the right temperature level so that the oil is light, between the 42 and the 50 API, and associated with it is a large component of light ends, C2s and C3s, better than you'd get in associated gas sometimes. The challenge for us now is to really look at the cost of production. There are good indications. I don't want to bore you with the geology. We're drilling 2 onshore wells in Bahrain, which should be flowing in the next few weeks, and we'll keep it on an extended flow test. Once the results are out, we would really be happy to share it with the industry. And one of the things we've been considering without telling our colleagues at Aramco is, can we use the old pipeline to push back some of the lighter ends to Amin, if he can handle them for us, if we're lucky, because I wouldn't know what to do with them. I can't give them to GPIC yet. But certainly exciting times. The same is happening at a more advanced pace in Saudi Arabia. In Oman, they have really developed their tight gas resource. So going into more difficult resource in oil and gas is the new trend. Now, can we maintain the very cheap feedstock cost? It all depends on how much it costs us to produce it. But the era of cheap oil, maybe even cheap gas, might be behind us. We will try to keep it as cheap as possible. The US discovered that it is cost competitive. Ethane there is now cheaper than many other places in the world. The same could happen here. The source rock here is as good as any, and it's, I think, typically they say the quality of the source rock is as good as the quality of the reservoirs, and the reservoirs in our region are second to none. I think in the area we're in, that area between Bahrain and the Jafurah Basin is probably the best sweet spot that you can get lighter ends. In what I have read, it is always associated with crude in the 30 API range. If you go into the lighter API, source rock there is a bit over mature, so it would have more gas, less lighter ends. If it becomes a bit heavier, it is below what's called the volatile oil and does not produce. So my advice, keep a watch on that space. The UAE has announced with Total that it has an ambitious plan to go after its tight oil / tight gas resources. A lot of potential for what could be ethane-based feedstock for the future could come out of that. So that's my last piece of advice. And again, thank you very much to GPCA for inviting me, a true honor. And thank you for your patience. Assalamu alaikum.